For our next panel, or I guess it's a fireside. It's the evolution of life science sector and the future of design, moderated by Robert Ayello, Senior Associate of JB&B, and featuring Matt Malone, Senior Vice President of Life Sciences at Taconic Partners, and David Stockel, Senior Vice President at CBRE. So Robert, I put this into your hands.
All right, thanks, Max, appreciate it. So good morning, Matt and David. Thanks for joining me for this fireside chat on the evolution of the life science sector and the future of design. Before we explore the owner, developer, and leasing side perspective of the current life science marketplace, with an emphasis, of course, on the New York metropolitan area, which is where we specialize, I would like to remind the audience that they can enter questions at any time in the Q&A module. But with that being said, one of the other themes that I want to touch upon during this chat and highlight is the collaboration that we've personally shared over the years through our three disciplines. That is owners, design professionals, and leasing agents, and how our alignment provides the most comprehensive view of the current market and the most realistic strategies moving forward. So to kick off this conversation and discussion, for Matt and David, what are the necessary steps to foster a successful collaboration among owner, design architect, engineer, and leasing representative? Also, what are the pitfalls? How do we overcome them when they arise? And how do we maybe even avoid them entirely? Matt, I'll let you kick it off.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks. Just to kind of point directly at it, I think I don't think it's magic. I think it's a pretty straightforward and simple thing. It requires an open mind and a collaborative spirit. I think having open communication between all three facets of the team is only going to benefit the team dynamic. I believe wholeheartedly, previously as a member of the design team up until recently, and now as a member of the ownership team, that the engagement of the design team and the advice or direction that is proffered by the design team is valuable, that needs to be taken into account. But I also feel very strongly that that information must be kind of balanced against market trends, which the leasing team is incredibly knowledgeable about, which is why we lean on them for that as well. So it really is, as you suggest or allude to, a very multifaceted, multidisciplinary effort that I think just requires the greatest potential collaboration and open channels of communication.
Yeah, I obviously agree with everything Matt said. Spot on, accurate. I would add a few things. One is, one of the things we talk about with clients is kind of defining what success looks like, right? So what makes a project successful? Obviously, leasing it in its entirety is a good first step, but there's a lot of other elements, defining what expectations are for each owner. Different owners have different motivations. They have different strategies they'd like to implement. So I think making sure that the entire team up front understands what the other's expectations are. And I would also say that, just getting out kind of your opinions, potential concerns that you have up front so that everyone understands what the goals are, what the expectations are for the project is critical. I would say, and Matt alluded to it, being flexible in today's ever-changing environment is really important. You can go in with a strategy that is hey, we're going to put in our base building infrastructure and then, kind of wait for an anchor tenant to come. And then all of a sudden, 6-9 months later, you're saying, you know what, let's pre-build some space because the strategy has changed and we thought we were a building that was a good landing spot for this profile of tenant. And it turns out, things have changed and now there's a different, subset of tenants that might be, good prospective tenants for the project. So being flexible, understanding how to change quickly, and just be responsive to tenants and tenant rep brokers' requests. A lot of these companies do have concerns going into it, and identifying those up front is important. And then just having a responsive team that can respond on short notice. We always hear about the hurry up and wait type of environment. So, sitting around and waiting for that tenant to finally show interest, and then all of a sudden things get going quickly, being able to be responsive to that is certainly important.
One other thing, Rob, I think that, I didn't mention, but I want to emphasize is having a team that has knowledge and skill in the subject matter. As life sciences, science and technology design, and leasing for that matter is very, very specific. There's a very small audience. It can go, in the wrong direction if you have too many missteps. The leasing team will tell you very quickly, you're in trouble here because of the fact that your team didn't necessarily design a laboratory building. So it's important to have a team that is experienced, a team that understands what it is that the final product is and that we're trying to achieve, and has potentially done this before and has experience and a position in the market.
And I think that those are great insights from you both, Matt and David. I think just to kind of circle back on something that you had said, David, about the flexibility and being able to pivot when necessary. Is there a certain inflection point where that needs to happen from all the parties that are involved in the project? And is there a paradigm in terms of a model that could be followed or passed along that keeps the team as flexible as possible throughout the process?
Well, I'll let Matt comment on some of the more technical aspects, and Robert, I'm sure you can as well, some of the design engineering aspects that you want to get aligned on up front. But I will say that there's an element of preparedness for buildings, right? Whether that's going ahead and speculatively building out some base building infrastructure, if not all of it, so that you can more rapidly respond to a prospective tenant's need to maybe occupy space in a shorter time period than what we may have originally thought. Sometimes there's different infrastructure components for some of the more technical requirements out there that we've seen that just need to be thought of up front and accommodated from a building infrastructure standpoint. So I think being prepared for those types of situations when they arise is certainly helpful to try and make sure that you're giving yourself essentially the best chance to succeed and secure that requirement and have the outcome be favorable for the owner as well as the tenant.
Sorry, I was muted for a moment there. I would echo. I think my position on it is this, and Rob, you and I have experienced this as well. If you're designing an infrastructure that is truly a lab capable infrastructure, then potentially having to make a pivot to a pre-built environment, being flexible in that regard is less of a commitment, less of a financial commitment than was previously assumed, because the building itself is already robust in its infrastructure that is prepared to handle a laboratory environment. And I think, that's a little bit, I don't want to suggest that the infrastructure design is geared toward doing a pre-built, but it does make it easier if your building truly is in a condition that it is lab ready, in order for us to potentially pivot in that need or potential. And then I think, Rob, what we've talked about in the past is simply making certain that we understand the parameters of the infrastructure, so that when those conversations do happen, when those offers do come in or the RFPs for space, where you've got some tenants interested in some space, and David will speak to this if necessary, that we know exactly what our building can do, because we've engineered it to a certain parameter, and we understand that, and we're walking into that lease negotiation with a certain intelligence as to what we think that building can do or should do, and what it can't. And then we can kind of parry that with what we think we need to do above and beyond what we intended, in order to meet the request of the potential tenant.
Thanks, Matt. And I think just one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, part of all three of us being involved in many projects in life sciences is the value of test fits during design. And I think that lends to the flexibility, Matt, that you were talking about in terms of understanding truly what type of building and services we would be providing to a maximum breadth of tenants out there, which is, of course, helpful on the leasing side, David. How valuable is that test fit as part of the design process, the thought behind the potential tenancy, and how does that help you with the leasing? right? And then feedback back to the developers in terms of the product that they can offer.
Yeah, test fits are critical. It does a lot of things. One of the first things that comes to mind for me, for tenant rep brokers and for their tenant, for their occupier clients, to be able to visualize what actually can go in the space. You'd be surprised how many people are not all that visual. And I would say in New York, we have an interesting dynamic of we're generally still an early stage life science market, right? So when you look at the profile of early stage companies, many times you have first time founders, co-founders, folks in decision-making roles. And, to be able to make their lives a bit easier to visualize what the space could look like, I think goes a long way. I think having, again, we keep talking about flexibility, but it's clearly, an important buzzword here. Having flexibility in the test fit as well, having a couple different iterations sometimes provides help. And then also just having, to the extent you can, any renderings, bring the space to life. And I would say further, it's even more important if you don't have any speculatively built space, right? A lot of people like to kind of walk in and touch and feel the space, if you will, really be able to get an understanding of how it'll operate, and they can envision themselves operating in the laboratory and in the office space in that facility. So if you don't have that, I'd say the test fits become even more critical. And, we've always advised our owner clients to, have a few, right? Have a couple different iterations, because you don't know what type of user is going to come along, whether it's a, basic biology company or more of an academic profile. They do have different expectations. So, having test fits and having, base building design criteria readily available, I think is also really important. Being able to kind of show that the work has been done up front, properly, gives the occupiers and their representatives a lot more comfort than not having those materials.
Yeah, I think David, between the two things you said, so test fits is one component of it if you don't have the pre-built environment. And I will say that Taconic has definitely committed themselves to making certain that we took advantage of the market in the way that we can to pre-build space in order to improve that speed to market conversation that we had in the previous panel. And I think that doing that has been instrumental, almost, unmeasurable in terms of the ability to bring somebody through a laboratory space, because, as you say, visualization is a challenge for a lot of folks. Rob, you and I in the design industry side of this, we can kind of close our eyes and know what these things look like, but not everybody can do that. And that's abundantly clear the more, I'm involved in taking people through these spaces. Or, whether they're in their raw state or they're in their pre-built space. So I think it's incredibly instrumental. I think the other thing that we found was particularly instrumental was the ability to take folks up onto the roof of the building, if you will, and showing them the infrastructure that is there, that is in place, that has been properly considered for their function, their use. So the test fits help facilitate a comfort level from the tenant side of things, to understanding that their potential landlord gets it in terms of their needs, in terms of what their requirements are, and is willing to work with them based upon those test fits, to kind of push and pull a little bit to make it more attuned to what the tenant needs. But I'll say the other side of this as the owner, what those test fits enable us to do is to make sure that our design intent, with all the flexibility that we intend to provide, is also on brand for us, is also something that is consistent with what we want to offer the market, as opposed to allowing the tenant to kind of dictate that to us entirely. I think, it facilitates us getting something more akin to what we would love to see in our buildings and our opportunities, but also works very, very well with what the tenant's needs are.
That's a great point, Matt. And, just to kind of transition the chat a little bit further, if we turn back the clocks a couple of years ago in terms of the New York City life science market, with over the past 2 years with the pandemic, for both Matt and David, what are some of the changes that we've seen in the life science market, in particular in New York City, after currently where we used to be I know we've been touching upon it. Speculative laboratory pre-builts is something that is much more common nowadays. But is there anything else that you've seen that has been a drastic change in the market that is something that we would need to adjust for in the future?
Matt, you want to start?
Sure. Drastic change, I'm not sure if I would say, during the pandemic that we've seen a drastic change, at least in New York. So we mentioned test fits, we mentioned pre-builds. I think that's important in New York specifically, and other nascent markets where, the product isn't easily understood or seen visibly, tangible, touch, feel. And I think that's something that, in fact, the pandemic and the kind of call it a hiatus has put a little bit more of a focus on, is to say, okay, look, my company right now is in a little bit more of a conservative mode. Are you able to get me what I need to get? And I think along those lines, what I've seen at least is, I've heard out of kind of both sides of the conversation. One side says, okay, we're seeing an increase in the lab percentage in terms of the breakdown of laboratory to office space. I've also seen a certain argument that says, but it isn't necessarily changing the ask in terms of the size of lease that's being asked for. So it isn't as though by an increase in laboratory space, the ask is getting larger. It is really just a rebalancing of the percentages. And then something that we've kind of focused on as part of our design aesthetic or design intent in terms of what we're providing, we've increased the potential for meeting and or collaborative space, because a lot of the conversations that we've heard in the market right now are that people still want private offices, which, to be honest with you, I know there's a big back and forth balance there, but people still want access to private offices, but they ultimately are coming into the environment to get access to the laboratory and ultimately to collaborate with their coworkers. So having that space is also, in my opinion, and in our opinion, crucial or important to bringing people back to the office, to the work environment as a post-pandemic life science offering.
So I would say a few things, over the past couple of years. For starters, most of our tenant clients were all deemed essential businesses, right, during COVID. So the labs stayed open and operational. Some logistical challenges, I'm sure, with rotational schedules within the lab to account for proper social distancing and whatnot. But generally speaking, I think every one of the labs that we are aware of stayed operational throughout COVID. So that was obviously, drastically different from the office using environment. I would say, two different buckets of occupiers of space that I noticed a trend was, the institutional tenants in the New York metro area that we work with, that we represent, that we transact with. They put a lot of their facilities requirements on hold for some time. Right, they had bigger issues at hand. The academics needed to figure out how to, safely and properly bring students back on campus, by way of example. Medical institutions, many of them were inundated with COVID patients. A lot of elective surgeries were put on hold because of the lack of facilities available. And fast forward now, and there seems to be a fair amount of pent-up demand for facilities requirements that were not addressed over the last couple of years for all the the reasons mentioned. So that's an interesting dynamic that's playing out now. I could think of probably a half dozen what we would call kind of quote unquote institutional lab space requirements that are ongoing right now throughout New York City. So those are exciting, and hopefully they'll get wrapped up soon and provide even greater tailwind for the leasing in the life science sector. One of the other challenges that we've noticed and we continue to notice are, continued supply chain challenges, right? So that does a couple things, right? It lengthens the ability, time for the ability for either a tenant to build out their space, or more often than not, the landlord to build out the space on the tenant's behalf. It also puts a greater emphasis on, being prepared and potentially pre-ordering long lead items, right? Generators could take a year to get on site these days. So landlords, where possible and where it makes sense from a business plan strategy perspective, pre-ordering materials that they know they're going to need at some point I think has been a strategy that's implemented more so now, direct correlation with what's happened over the past 2 years. I would say one trend that has continued is that we still have a pretty severe lack of built lab product in New York City, right? So our availability rate for built lab space is probably 1%. Matt is the proud owner, I think, of the one spec lab suite that's available in all of New York City at Hudson Research Center at 619 West 54th Street. So that's a continued challenge, I think, and many landlords, many clients of my team are certainly looking to address that, and they've the ones that have pre-built space have been successful in leasing them. So that should be a trend that hopefully continues, a little bit more space being brought onto the market over the next few quarters. So those are some of the things that came to mind for me. And then I would say the other trend that we're generally seeing, and it's not throughout the market, but it is definitely a trend worth noting, is that many of the tenants are looking for some sort of turnkey solution for their lab facilities, whether that's leasing speculatively built lab and office, pre-built space, or whether that's coming to the landlord and saying, here's my space program, here are my needs, here's my equipment needs, et cetera. Here's the work I'm doing in the lab. How do we figure out some sort of turnkey solution where the landlord can use their expertise and build a team like us on this panel right now to help support that effort and take the onus off of the tenant, who many times, is just not really looking to take on a construction project of this complexity on their own. So different ways to get from, warm shell to fully built out lab space. But I think depending on the tenant, many of them are looking for that turnkey solution in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think that last point is really, really a great point, David, because I think that kind of underlines or emphasizes what we were talking about earlier with the test fits, because ultimately it is those test fits that very quickly become the beginnings of that turnkey solution. Because as an owner, we've got an understanding of what we can get our hands on, what we can ultimately, how we like to see our spaces fit out as a result of that, and offer it more as a turnkey if necessary, and say, hey, look, we've got a certain standard that we've established with our test fits. We will, make manipulation to meet your needs as necessary, but it will ultimately be kind of pre-baked as one of those test fit environments, at least to some extent. So it does hit that hybrid of pre-built and build to suit, very well. The other thing you mentioned, in fact, you mentioned the institutional clients, which I think, Rob, I was absent in saying it, but it is a great point. We've seen with the COVID that a lot of the academic institutions have kind of pulled back and had to let their students leave campus and such. I think at this point now that they're starting to kind of come back to a certain degree of normalcy, a lot of those institutions are saying, and this is twofold, but a lot of those institutions are saying, we don't want to build more real estate. We've seen the risk associated with having more real estate. We'd rather go out and become, commercial tenants in that regard. So we're seeing a lot more activity from the institutional clients, I think, in that regard, where they're looking to build out lab space through a lease environment, especially in a place like New York, where land, quite frankly, is not easy to get your hands on as far as campus environments are concerned.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting with the potential turnkey solutions that would be offered to tenants. I guess, David, in terms of leasing structure as well as durations, are we seeing any change in the market in terms of what tenants are typically looking for?
I would say for the early stage subset of tenants, there's always been a misalignment of, having 2 years of cash burn rate by design versus the longer term kind of static nature of a lease commitment. That continues to be, a challenge that's been addressed with some creative solutions. But what I think it really does is puts a lot of emphasis on paths to growth, the ability for a landlord to provide growth solutions for when that tenant hopefully does experience success prior to the natural lease expiration, and addressing growth either within the building itself or a portfolio of buildings that an owner may control within the same market. So that's definitely a trend that continues to be very noteworthy. We get real-time feedback on prospective tenant tours of buildings. This space looks great and it should house me for 2 to 3 years, let's say, from when I occupy, where do I grow from there? What are the logical solutions, whether it's within the building or, again, a landlord's portfolio? That's definitely, and then I would say on the larger institutional side, I don't think lease term lengths have changed a whole lot. We're working on a few right now. They're kind of 10 to 15 year lease terms for what I would categorize as mid-size requirements. So think 30 to 75,000 square feet of space. And then we're also seeing a couple, solutions where there's a creative strategy of a 30-year leasehold condo structure for tenants who that's applicable for. So the larger tenants still, I would say, generally speaking, are committing to longer term leases. And the other thing that I think is really noteworthy is that many of these occupants, particularly the large institutional commercial lab users, they change their facilities quite regularly throughout the duration of the lease. So taking a long-term lease and understanding that they're going to spend additional capital of their own, usually of their own, every 3 to 5 years within an envelope of space. We've seen tenants certainly do that, and so a short-term lease in that situation would not be helpful. So taking a longer-term lease, being able to control the space for a longer amount of time, and then obviously addressing growth when it's needed.
I think short-term leases are a fact of life when we're talking about these kind of cutting edge, early stage companies. I'm not trying to suggest that I love them, that we've got this incredible appetite for them, but at the same time, I think it's kind of it's a reality to some extent where we're, expecting to see, shorter term lease offerings than we're used to in a typical office environment.
Yeah, and Rob, I would just add the one of the other trends we're continuing to see is amenities are definitely a key focus for many occupiers, particularly the smaller occupiers. The larger institutional occupiers who are going to take a block of floors and a significant amount of space tend to amenitize their space within their own envelope that they're committing to. But the earlier stage companies, the graduates out of incubators, as a prime example, certainly looking for both laboratory amenities and traditional office amenities within a building. So, we're seeing many landlords looking to accommodate that with shared facilities, whether it's shared lab facilities like autoclave, glass wash, things like that, versus more traditional office amenities, conferencing space, place to host symposia, things like that, grab and go options for food and beverage, bike rooms, showers, all the usual amenities that you see in many office buildings certainly apply to many of these lab buildings as well.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a flight to quality either. I think that was always a case, even say pre-COVID, for these smaller scale startup companies, where they were a little bit more dependent upon in our case, the landlord, to provide some of those amenities to them, where previously they're coming out of institutions that were previously providing them those things, and they're just a little bit too early. They haven't quite fully left the nest to a certain extent, if you want to say that. And as a result, there's a little bit more support that is desirous of the tenants, or by the tenants, I should say.
Yeah, and I think it brings up, this entire conversation brings up the scalability of the product offering, right? To kind of match the different types of tenants, the graduates out of incubators, as you facilitate or have options for their growth within the confines of your product building, to support that with the amenities that would be offered as shared experiences before they grow to the point where they can provide those amenities within their own confines. We do have a question from the audience that we'd like to get just some feedback on. The question is, what basic components do you suggest get placed within a pre-built spec space? So what would we be offering from the developer side as well? What would we be looking for on the leasing side on one of these speculative pre-built spaces?
Well, when we approach this, and when I approach this from the design side as much as now approaching it from the developer or landlord side, I think the basics, if you will, right? So that we talk about a 50-50 lab office split, which, as I mentioned earlier, is starting to skew a little bit more to a 60 lab, 40 office. But we talk about that. We also talked about the basics having, at least in the way that we've approached these efforts at HRC and at 125, are what we would basically call lab support rooms, or which are essentially flex rooms. We design them with an infrastructure to handle laboratory infrastructure primarily, but they can be utilized for supplemental MEP support as well, or other purposes or other services associated with lab function. And so usually, those are the types of rooms that either could become microscopy suites or tissue culture rooms, just as easily as they could become mechanical support spaces for cylinder storage, or the autoclave spaces that David mentioned earlier, glass wash rooms or freezer storage. So those are the kinds of things that you kind of want to have day one. Now, as far as what you're putting in terms of your bench, what we do is a very flexible bench scenario. So we've got a consistent bench offering that we deliver with our pre-built environment. It's all served from overhead panels, so that there's a flexibility inherent within that. You can kind of plug and play and reconfigure the laboratory with minimal effort and minimal cost. So that's something else that we, like to bring into the environment. I think building to building, landlord to landlord, what they're providing at those panels or at those benches will vary. And I would say the same is true even with the office environment. Some landlords tend to offer a relatively simple, straightforward open office environment that is for the tenant to come in and fit out. Others, when we do a pre-built space, we'll go full out with the FF&E as well. So we're providing everything from the TVs on the walls in the conference rooms to the desks and the chairs within those office environments. When we say it's a pre-built environment, it really is move-in ready, save for what we estimate at the 20% additional work that most tenants will come in and want to see to kind of customize or make it their own. So we usually try to get 80% of the way there and allow the tenant to come up to the other 20%.
Yeah, everything Matt said, certainly agree with. I think just in the lab environment, the basics are providing laboratory benches, casework, lab support rooms with robust air exchange capacity, robust electricity. In the office space, I would say it's more building by building, case by case, whether it's being kind of built out in a generic open environment, or if it's a bit more built out with private rooms, whether they're offices or conference rooms, is up to the user. And then, the back of house, concerns obviously are important as well. It's backup generator capacity, which plugs and outlets are on backup generator capacity, how much is being provided to the tenant kind of on a spec basis. Is that sufficient for what they need? Those are some of the questions that come up on tours and in proposals with prospective tenants.
Right. So it sounds like, David, in terms of for those tours with potential tenants, it's important for the design team to put together a summary, right, that is easy to digest of what the MEP infrastructure offering is, so that it can be communicated through the owner to the leasing agent to the tenant, so that there's a clear understanding, in addition to the test fits that give the look and feel of what the program could be, but also more importantly, what the air exchanges are, the watts per square foot, normal and emergency, so that it's pretty clear in terms of numbers, so that the tenant can really understand what is being offered from that product.
Yeah, definitely. I think having a thoughtful yet somewhat concise kind of offering, whether it's on a billboard floor plan test fit that's within the suite, or something that can easily be shared from the landlord and their agents to the tenants and their tenant rep brokers, with all the specifications that you'd expect to see. The initial impression and the initial feedback from tenants is critical, right? So that first impression that's made once they whether they look at a prospective building on paper or actually come for a physical tour, just making sure you have all of your boxes checked that say, hey, this is obviously a lab capable or lab ready building, depending on the building. It gives them a lot of instant comfort knowing that, okay, this owner knows exactly what is expected to be provided and what's market.
Yep.
Matt.
And then ultimately we will ask David and his team to give us the feedback as to what the tenants are looking for the next project. You know, it becomes a bit of a cyclical thing. It builds upon itself.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's self-aware.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, looks like we're out of time.
Thank you, guys. That was great. That was a wonderful conversation. And thank you to everybody who was watching us today. We hope you enjoyed the event. I would also like to thank today's sponsors, our presenting sponsors, CBRE, and program sponsors, AKF Group, INEAD, JB&B, MG Engineering, SGA, and our association partner, NYC Builds BioPlus. Be sure to tune in to our upcoming events. We have a Tech Insider Live program on climate action this Thursday, as well as a workplace innovations program on July 27th. Our team has dropped the registration links into the chat here for anyone who would like to register and join us for those events. And thank you all. Have a great week.
Thank you.